Hi everyone, welcome back to Reference Board. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Assassin's Creed Origins references. So if you're new here, we take a look at different reference material from video games or movies or real life, and we see what we can take away from it. We just have a nice discussion, talk about the artistry, give our subconscious minds a little bit of artistic inspo. Alright, so Assassin's Creed Origins is a game I really love. It's got one of the most impressive game worlds I've ever seen in a video game. Ubisoft really did a good job with that. Most of my references aren't here, sadly. These are ones that I just managed to scrape off my hard drives, but there are 40 and I've randomly generated 35, so we're going to zoom in here. So one of the things I noted in a previous video where we took Assassin's Creed Odyssey is Ubisoft tend to do this thing where once the main game is over, then there's access to like some very dreamlike alternative world type spaces. So they're always trying to find the line and the balance between realistic, classical type environments, things which historians would be proud of, and things which are much more spectacular and fantasy and non-realistic, but still taking the cultural elements in. So it's always interesting to see that. And we get a little bit of that here with the giant Anubis structures. And what if I remember rightly, is a pathway to a dreamlike state where you can go into like the Duat, so the afterlife spaces for old pharaohs. At least I'm pretty sure that's what this is referencing in this space. It was a pretty cool idea because you'd be able to go to the Valley of the Kings. Then they'd have very different spaces, which I think were kind of representative of who they were in life. But just talking a bit more visually, the ancient Egyptian aesthetics of extremely large structures combined with very imposing dark elements that are kind of intended to remind you of your mortality and your place in life and to do good in life, because fundamentally your heart will be weighed and you'll be judged, is always something that captures the imagination. So there's a lot of emphasis on gateways, pathways to the afterlife, and that's kind of why Anubis is here. Another thing I noticed about Egyptian type gateways and spiritualism is the presence of water. So that's a little bit more obscure, but we see like the water along the base here. But I think I know why. It's because of the Nile, right? The Nile, the lifeblood, played such a kind of huge part in the culture that kind of wading through it, I think, like represents something grounding or represents kind of being part of the kind of spiritual flow of life. So when looking at environments like this, I find it quite meaningful because it feels like all those things are being tied together. But this is a dark one, so there's not actually too much to look at. So we'll jump to another one as well. Let's take a look at number 10. So you see, this is the representation of jumping from the more fictional, stylized and dreamlike to something slightly more realistic. So if I recall, this might be in one of the complexes in front of one of the pyramids in like the Giza area. There's lots of temple-like building structures, but this one is a nice kind of place, again, a representation of maybe monolithic structures that light can bounce through. These are the kinds of things that, minus the character, I really want to play with a bit more in Blender, just because these type of basic lighting scenes are really great for like material tests. And you can imagine how that would work because you've got a combination of surfaces, right? You've got flat surfaces, got slightly odd concave type surfaces here. You've got space for like ambient occlusion or grunge-like gaps between objects if you do have them separate. And you've got various spaces for different densities of detail. So you've got like high density details here and then lower density details along the surfaces. Also, if you do this kind of modularly, so you're making the individual bricks, you have little debris piles. It's very easy to move them apart and kind of jitter things up a bit. So you could have light sources reaching in from different places if you wanted. At the moment, there's two core ones and then one kind of artificial one there. But what this does, looking at it, is this has reminded me that, hey, actually, I really need to make some demo scenes just like this because it's going to be super handy for me, especially if we're talking about lighting. For like my afterglow lighting assets, which I make for Blender, which are emissive spatial mesh lights, it'd be great to kind of do things around this. But for you, maybe you might look at this and you might look at the texture details and think, yeah, maybe that's something I want to recreate. Maybe we can see like the kind of the strandy patterns on it from like the manufacturing process, and that gives you an indication of storytelling when thinking about materials. The artists at Ubisoft, they do put a lot of effort into research, and I'm seeing that now more when looking at the art books, because I've got the art books for Origins, Valhalla and Shadows, and there are sections in there for discussing the material creation, and they really do think a lot about it. So I love spaces like this. They're a good reminder for me. All right, let's go for another one. So I've got 40. So coming on down to 40. Okay, I believe this is Thebes, and then I think the Valley of the Kings is behind us in this camera perspective. Now, the resolution isn't amazing on this. I mean, I did take it on a lower res computer, but the artistry is still fantastic. So there's two kind of categories we can look at. We can look at the character and the environment, minus technical details like the level of detail not being particularly fantastic, which is why we can't see the vegetation down there. So first of all, environment scale is amazing. That's one of the things I really appreciated about the game. It's huge, like the world spaces. Then you can see that down here where we've got like the two, I'm not sure if these are like ram type god representations or Bastet, but I think it's more like a ram, where a player can climb up from the river, kind of walk along, go between two pillars, and move down, but they'll have to cross a desert to get to the valley. But this pathway here, this gateway, is connected to the other side, so the other temple of Thebes here, but in between is a large expanse of water. And that's an interesting thing to keep in mind for like your potential artworks, is that most of the time when we see bodies of water, they are just not connective between structures, unless there's a bridge, obviously, but they're more kind of intrusive, and things are built along the borders of the river rather than using the river as a part of it. So the idea of having something that is fundamentally part of something on the other side like this is interesting. And I've noticed that with Assassin's Creed Shadows as well, there's a section in it where part of going to a shrine is the journey of taking a boat across a river to get to it. So I can imagine there'd be some really interesting artistic perspectives, you know, having a camera down here and then having like a superstructure on the other side that's incorporating like the water flow into it. And the reflectivity of having like the temple, we can't see as much here, but actually on the water as well, would provide some really great composition shots as well. So that could be something to think about. Also, there's just so much of these like symmetrical parallels of gateways, as we can see. Then we've got more of the statues there and like a path of ascension up to the temple. And symmetry, gateway, and it's just so many layers upon layers of symmetry and gateways, representations of life and death and journeys. And it's one of my favorite styles, you know, seeing all of that. You know, in classical times, a lot of these things are reminders of life and death and your place in the universe. And I think it's kind of something that we lose a bit in the modern day, particularly in Europe, where we look at palaces just as like grandiose exemplifications of money and class and status, rather than something that intrinsically binds humanity to the idea of like the earth and the supernatural. We also see an interesting scale distribution again, finer details for the people and the villages, and then larger details for the important superstructures, and then an even larger terrain in the background. So we have like a progression of scale moving between the space, also afforded by large, almost empty details, but with smaller details between. So this is what you would call like visual rest area, if you want to, before we have spaces where the eye can migrate its focus. As for the character, we have a variety of things going on. We have what we'd consider more traditional cultural elements, but also mixed in with complete fiction. So for example, this shield is part of like a different fictional series. Ubisoft do a thing every now and again where like they blend in stuff from other like video games and series just for the fun of it. So that's not appropriate for this place. But again, the artistic liberty is still fun and interesting. So when we're looking at things like this, which I believe is like a Horus inspired like armor piece and garment, that feels more appropriate even if it's not based on something real, because again, it's kind of just an abstraction of the cultural motifs. It is something that's fun for players to experience. So just like with the Odyssey video, this reminds me it's a potential artistic challenge. If you were to imagine a classical culture, how would you abstract some of the motifs present in that culture into something else, like an armor piece? What would a superhero from that culture look like? What would your home represented in that culture look like? What would an alien world, if imposed by that culture, look like? And I suppose for Egypt, that has already been represented in Stargate. You know, what if you did alternative cultures? So hopefully this has given you something to think about. I really like Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I should probably jump back in there and get some more references from that. Anyway, if you made it this far through the video, put some kind of artistic related emoji in the comments. If you're on Windows, use the Windows key and the period key to bring up an emoji keyboard. And from there, you can search for emojis. So if you look for like the paintbrush, put that in the comments. I'll see if you made it this far through the video. If you want to support my work, go to patreon.com/CurtisHolt. Otherwise, if you want Blender resources, go to curtisholt.online/store. Otherwise, have a fantastic day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.